Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, honoured guests and friends, it's absolutely delightful to be here with you. I want to just say a quick word about my dear guest here. While Dan Jurgen is certainly the guru in the oil market, my guest is the guru when it comes to renewables. When we look at this audience and look at the great work that's going on here, and indeed this conference, only 8 years ago this was set up, and I can tell you that my dear friend here would probably have not been invited. He might have been at a conference, maybe a smaller one down the road, but he probably wouldn't have been invited here to talk to financiers. And we're going to find out just why. Definitely the organization would have looked at his company, New Energy, and thought, very interesting little company, probably a very interesting guy. Yes, we'll keep an eye on him. But he's still incredibly interesting, I have to say. He's become extremely relevant, and he's become mainstream. So, Michael Liebreich, my guest here, I do want to talk to you, Bloomberg New Energy, and it's an absolute delight, as we say, to be here. So, how does it feel to be, as always, interesting, but more relevant and mainstream now?
Well, you're absolutely right. That was in your introduction. That, I have been coming here for about 8 or 9 years. And obviously, around that time was the early days of the Mazda initiative. And so, there was that, of course, going on. So there was a part of Abu Dhabi which was always, interested and engaged with our work and the research that my team was doing. But a mainstream audience and mainstream financiers would not have been engaged, were not engaged, and we tried to drum up interest, and we actually knocked on a lot of doors, and it was tough. It was tough. Now, it is really, really different, yes. Particularly around the electricity sector. It's easy to say, well, this is about energy, and then we slip into talking about electricity kind of seamlessly. The electricity sector is transforming. Renewable energy efficiency, whether it's LED light bulbs or new appliances, these are all mainstream. And so, and it has opened up an enormous number of doors and engagement with audiences like this, because it's such a manifestly obvious mainstreaming of these technologies, yes.
And of course, it puts you in hot demand. I'd like to put a quick question out here and get a feel from our audience just before we talk about, the fact that it has become mainstream, but again, that money is there, they're looking at you, and really think about what the financial markets, where's your role here? Has the financial markets, embraced new energy sufficiently? And what we're talking about, Michael, is really new energy, the transition towards new energy. There's quite a lot within the new energy and the renewables. So let's have a feel and just see, how do you feel about that? And we're going to get started like now. The minute of suspense here. 73% say it has not embraced it. So the potential out there is absolutely incredible, because we've got some believers, 27% have put their money on there. And just as well as that, this brings me nicely on to a fabulous report I have here that I think every one of you should make sure you get a copy of it. It is an MBAD report, but they're not being biased on this. It has a lot of work been put in by PricewaterhouseCoopers, Cambridge University, a very, very comprehensive report. And what Dan was talking about when he talked about the new energy demands that will come into the market. This report is actually saying that it will need $48 trillion worth of investments in the next 20 years to actually meet that energy demand. It's not all going to be oil and gas. So the markets, there's room here, they haven't really embraced it sufficiently. How can they, and why should they?
So I'm fascinated by the result of that poll. I mean, it's fantastically good news for my business, because it means that a quarter of the industry, the financial industry, is engaged, and 3/4 is not. Yes. So there's lots of potential there. I think. Let me just say that I think that it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think that there is a mainstream. That's a single question. There is mainstream understanding of the shift to particularly renewable energy in the electrical system. There is less understanding about the other elements. You talked about, there is energy efficiency, there is carbon capture and storage, there is changes in the way that gas is being used in the electrical system. Then there's all of transportation, then there's buildings, and Her Excellency, the Minister, just spoke about some of the building initiatives. So there's a lot of other, and those other areas are less well understood. But I'm not sure it's understood just how profound these changes, even in the electrical system, are going to be. So when I started New Energy Finance, as it then was, before I sold it to Bloomberg, renewable energy was at these incredibly sort of small, just never mind.
It was a niche area.
It was very niche, but and it's now more than half of all investment in electricity generating capacity is renewables, more than half. There's nothing alternative about it. And it's not going to stop because the ability to integrate renewable energy is increasing just as fast as the costs of renewable energy are coming down. So it's very, very profound.
And there's been a huge shift there when we look back, particularly in electricity. Countries around the world have eased out coal in terms of power plants. Oil is almost gone in terms of fueling power plants. The natural gas still there, but the growth in renewables and the potential. And the figures really speak for themselves. Out of that figure also, NBAD is also saying that to finance this future, about 640 billion out of the 48 trillion will go towards renewables.
So the 48 trillion is I think it's between now and 2040, and it's all energy technologies.
All energy.
So what we've got is around at the moment, well, not around, exactly at the last year, 380 billion going into the definition of clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, power storage, battery technologies and so on. Out of about, if you annualize it, it's about just under 2 trillion every year being invested in energy, and about just under 400 billion of that's going to clean energy. So you can see it's already kind of 25% of all of the investment funds, just under between 20 and 25%. But it is the bit, really striking last year was the cancellation of oil and gas projects and a new record for investment in clean energy. So, the question, does the fall in oil and gas prices, has that stalled the investment in renewable energy? And the answer was a resounding no, for all sorts of reasons.
And it's interesting too, I was just reading a new report from PricewaterhouseCoopers. 2014, M&A activity actually in the renewable space was 28 billion. That's 2014. Last year, and this report just came out today, or this weekend, 2015, it was more than 55 billion. So it's almost doubled just on the M&A activity. And they're very, very bullish in terms of what's going to happen in the year ahead. Now, you did not start New Energy Finance, as a charitable cause. You were not a tree hugger. You were probably a very different voice in the energy industry at the time when you started back in, 2004. But again, why did you see, it's not just, it's a new concept almost of green energy. It's now the color of money, really, isn't it? That's what it's about. And in a way, that's where the industry has to really embrace it, doesn't it?
So, you're absolutely right. I started New Energy Finance, as it then was, because what I could see is a number of, if you like, storm clouds gathering over the traditional energy system, whether it was geopolitics, whether it was depletion, whether it was these high costs that Dan spoke about in the earlier session, this inflation in the cost of exploration and extraction, whether it was climate change, whether it was air pollution in the cities, which is a huge factor in energy choices now. I could see all these problems, but I could also see the microeconomics around solar prices were going to come down, wind prices were going to come down, the prices of control of distributed assets. If you put a solar panel on your roof 20 years ago, it would be impossible to know what it's doing. Right now, you go on the internet and it costs nothing, and you can check how sunny it is and whether it needs cleaning and so on. So the cost of control coming down. And so I could see you've almost got these sort of storm clouds gathering on one side, and then you've got the costs of solutions coming down on the other. And now, again, as Dan said, batteries for electric cars, all of these clean energy technologies have unremitting experience curves. They just become, they're like flat screen TVs. They just get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until at some point, you say, well, they may have some intermittency disadvantages, but they're so cheap now, solar, wind and solar both, that you say, well, we have to use some of them. Then the question is, how much? What is the right mix? And that changes over time. You get more and more and more.
And indeed, we can see that shift is there. And you look here in the UAE, we have a Ministry of Energy. Many ministries around the world may have petroleum, may have gas, may have electricity, may have even renewable energy. They have several ministries. Here, it's very much embracing the whole energy portfolio. And this is really, I think, what governments have to do, because they need that diversification of energy at the moment. They'll need it in the future. How do you feel the political will is in terms of support from the policymakers to move the renewable agenda? It looks good on paper out there. I mean, but realistically, is it happening?
Well, it is happening, and the last speaker, the minister, was very, she listed the sorts of initiatives, and we see this around the world. I mean, we track this in 160 countries, 180 countries. Very specifically, we produce for the developing world a piece of work called Climate Scope. We really go into the detail, but you see it in the developed world as well. Everywhere, governments are working to enable this transition. So you do see it. There is the commitment. And what's been very interesting has been, the events in Paris, the Paris Agreement, because, really the model is not that Paris agreed and then we're going to have to sort of run around executing it. It's going to be the other way around. You've got...
Hold that thought a minute.
Yeah.
I want to bring you in on this. Let's have a quick think of what you think about the Paris Agreement. COP21, is this what's going to lead the world, because everybody was involved, into the new energy era? Let's just get a feel from this audience here. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that bankers mightn't have watched every detail of COP, but let's just see, how you've taken this to heart. And it's only really a month old. Aha! Ooh, this is really tough. Gosh, this is like a UAE sponsorship, isn't it? 51-49.
That's going to be the result of the Brexit referendum in Britain in a few months. Not sure which way it's going to go.
Wow, so we haven't convinced everybody here. Yeah. So now it's up to you. Tell us. Give us your take on it.
So, Paris is not binding. If you put the pile of documents from each country, these so-called INDCs, you pile them up and you say, this is what we've all agreed to do, then it doesn't add up to very much. It bends the curve, but not by much.
And so the INDC's really been the wish list and
these
the commitments.
Well, these are the considered plans of the individual countries saying, we're going to do this, because it is a sort of voluntary framework. And so it's easy to say, well, Paris doesn't add up to a hill of beans. It doesn't actually do anything. But I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong because you've got built into Paris, first of all, it has bent the curve. The business as usual has now been reduced. And it's been reduced because of the progress on the electrical system. I think that what Paris does that was remarkable was to say that all of these countries, there is transparency, so they have to report their progress against those plans, number one. And number two, they have to come back and produce other plans. So when I say have to, that is the binding content.
So they're being held more accountable this time.
Exactly, they're being held accountable. So Paris doesn't force anything, but then there are many treaties. The NATO treaty doesn't force anybody to do anything. Yeah. It's a framework and so on. So, but also what Paris did, I think crucially, was it gives the sense of inevitability. Business people now aren't asking whether there'll be something, whether they have to think about, whether their board should bring in an expert to think about, maybe a response. They're saying this is going to happen. When is the right time to do what? So it's become much more of a kind of a process. And now, will it get to 2 degrees? Or the wording in Paris, the other extraordinary thing was they even enshrined the wording well below 2 degrees, which is, but that, to be honest, in my view, that's somewhat fanciful. we probably won't get to 2 degrees. But the process, that train is now kind of leaving a station and it's accelerating and has a sense of inevitability about it.
Do you think it will very much unite the political will? And is it about putting pressure, almost peer pressure, on countries? Because as you say, yes, the train has left the station, the momentum is in place. We're seeing incredible results from the projects that are there. So why not? It makes great economic sense. And social sense.
It will move the political and the industry after industry, the chemicals industry, the airline industry. They will have to have they will have to respond. I don't know if I agree with the word unite, because I suspect what will happen is that players who resist will sort of be marginalized, and players who are with that agenda globally will tend to sort of find themselves their careers will advance more rapidly. I don't know, that's just a view on change.
Yes.
It's more likely that, I'm not sure how many people's, if you have a hardened climate skeptic in the US, I don't know if they're going to be persuaded by Paris. In fact, I know they're not.
Right. Now, when we look at the challenges, though, that are in place, and there still are many, I mean, renewables, I think, is very mainstream. I think everybody here is, very familiar. When we look at energy, it is very much up there on the agenda. But what are the big challenges? Dan mentioned storage. You've briefly mentioned it. Is that a big stumbling block right now? Is enough been done, and are we just waiting for a breakthrough?
So there'll be 2 that we should cover. One is storage in the sense of the electrical system, and I think the other one is probably transportation.
I want to get onto that totally separately, because that's a very
except that they're linked, because storage storage, of course, it's the same. It's the same technologies that can unlock both. But before moving on to transportation, there's a big. Where are we now? We've got very cheap wind and solar. When I say very cheap, I mean very cheap. Yeah. Wind being produced at 3 US cents per kilowatt hour, unsubsidized. Solar, we heard from the minister just now, under 6 cents. There's a Peruvian project that has just been signed that's under 5 cents per kilowatt hour for solar.
And of course, here in the UAE, we've
here in UAE, 5.8 cents, and there'll be more. So we're in an era of, let's call it 3 to 5, 3 to 7, depending on where you are in the world, cents for large amounts of renewable energy. The problem is, of course, it's not sunny at night, and the wind doesn't always blow, and not everybody has geothermal, and some of the other alternatives, offshore wind and so on, are quite expensive. So you've got these, but intermittent renewables are growing, and I would take issue a little bit with these sort of slightly dismissive statistics, like, wind is 0.2% of energy, and solar is 0.2%, and wind is 0.7%. Because first of all, go to the electricity system, the numbers are bigger, because take out transportation and heat and industry. But also take out, those statistics all are based on primary energy, and there's an interesting fact. Primary energy gives credit to, for instance, the coal industry for its thermal losses, which are 60% of primary energy in that sector. So, what you've actually got is Germany, 30% renewable electricity, UK over the winter, 25%. California, 30%, Texas, 12%. The target here, 7% solar. It starts to look very, very modest, but it's intermittent. So how do you deal with that? And there's a lot of commentators, a lot of investors are thinking, you need storage. Intermittent, so you need storage.
Yes.
But be careful, because the cheapest way to manage intermittency is actually have better weather forecasting. So when things are, you can then plan, and you can hybridize your grid with probably existing fuel-based, natural gas-based assets.
And that's, I think, what's happening in some areas, and happening very successfully.
And you can go very, very far. I think the point I want to make is that before you need to do storage, you can do demand response, you can connect your grids over larger areas, you can improve the management of your grid, buying and selling electricity in a quarter of an hour instead of half an hour, and only then do you need storage. And so storage will be a big part of it, but I just worry that when everybody sort of rushes into it and says, this is the next big thing, just be careful. There's some other big things that are happening more quickly.
So it makes for good headlines at the moment, particularly when people want to say there is a huge stumbling block, and therefore perhaps keep people in their safe zone as opposed to making the investment that might be needed to move on.
What you find is that in the actual control rooms of the grids around the world, where the people actually run the renewables and say, right, we've got too much sun, or there's a cloud, or it's not windy enough, and so on, those people are not saying, give me storage quickly.
Yes.
They're not saying that. Right? They want to improve the way their markets are functioning.
Now, talk to me about transportation, and I know you're very busy advising the Mayor of London. You're looking at Transport of London, and indeed it's something very close to your heart. There's a lot moving in the transportation area. You look at an area like this, perhaps we also need maybe a little of advising in terms of how we look at what's going on here. But it's something, this is a car community. And when you look at how communities and how development happens, the one thing people want to do is they want to buy their personal car. Dan was talking about there the growth in population and the growth in car demand from 1 billion up to 2. They're not all going to be pumping the same petroleum, gasoline that we're seeing today. There's going to be a shift there. Talk to me a bit more about your take on transportation and where that's going in the new energy space.
Well, so I'm very bullish on electric vehicles. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one comes back to the point of storage and the battery costs. The electric vehicles right now, everybody knows that the Tesla is a fabulous car, but everybody also knows that it costs $100,000 or $80,000 or whatever it is for the stripped down version.
So it's not ready for the mass market.
It's not a mass market. It's
that's
not
what you
exactly
need. Yes.
Exactly. But the biggest cost of the electric vehicle is the battery. Battery costs came down 35% last year. They'll come down another 10 or 15% this year. Then we'll get the big factories, the gigafactory that Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has launched, and others. There are other big battery manufacturers working on very substantial capacity increases. And so we're going to see battery prices come down in a similar way to solar. Not quite the same experience curve. It's a little bit more shallow, but they're going to come down very considerably, very, very considerably. Dan mentioned the new Tesla, the new Tesla, the little Tesla, which will be $35,000 and I think probably a 200-mile range. But there's already the BMW i3. There's the Volkswagen e-Golf. I mean, a Golf is a family car. It is a normal, it's a small family car in the US and family car in Europe. You're seeing then there'll be the Tesla to add to that. These are 30 to 35,000 pound cars before the battery prices have really come down, and they have a 200-mile range. A couple of other things, a couple of other reasons why I think that's why this becomes a game changer. Second cars. Nearly 2/3 of households in the US have got second cars.
They probably
and
have
second
here
cars,
too. Yeah.
and I'm sure here
Maybe
as well.
3.
And,
yes.
and the range anxiety problem is much less of an issue. Second car is used for take the kids to school, go shopping and so on. Second cars, for people who've got a garage or a place to charge it themselves, I think it becomes almost a no-brainer as the price of these cars comes down. Two other things. One is the cars drive very nicely.
Yes.
They are smooth. You don't have to go to gas stations. They accelerate like crazy.
They're scarily silent sometimes.
They're nice, which is very relaxing when you drive long distances. I don't actually have one, I should say. But they're also fabulous platforms for all of the autonomous driving elements that are being introduced. They have lower maintenance, and city after city after city after city in the world has got a pollution problem. This is not just a Beijing, Delhi thing. I'm on the board of Transport for London. We grapple with air quality issues, and electric vehicles are one of the solutions to that.
And of course, in somewhere like London too, there's the initiative from the policymakers in London to encourage people to use them. There's a congestion charge that you don't have to pay. So again, it's all about making economic sense and making it make me
we've not-
feel better.
To be fair, we've not been very successful yet, and in the sense that there hasn't been a mass move in the way that there has been in Oslo. But this is absolutely on the agenda, and at the moment, it's electric buses that are being brought in. You've got in China huge numbers, by the way, of electric buses and also CNG, compressed natural gas, because it's not just the shift to electric vehicles,
and the public transportation
but alternative fuels of all sorts. But then taxis and minicabs is what we're working on in London. But so the question, I mean, just to frame it back to the conversation and back to Dan's remarks, one of his caveats was what happens with electrification of vehicles and batteries. And I come from maybe it's because the company's new energy finance and the heritage of the company working on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Dan's caveat is our central scenario. We're looking at perhaps by 2040, we've just produced figures that show 35% of vehicles being sold being electric. That's our central scenario.
Okay, Michael.
So our caveat would be that might not happen.
All right, but I mean, just take a look back, and we've recently seen the World Oil Outlook from OPEC, and we've seen the International Energy Agency just update its medium-term report, and BP's issued its reports, and Exxon, all the big players are doing it. They are completely depending on the transportation sector, and they're looking at the transportation sector and almost saying, this is ours. You can have, in terms of oil, power stations, but transportation, very much there is what they're saying will lead the big global oil demand. Are they not reading the same information that you're reading?
Well, maybe they're not reading the same information that we're writing, is the question I would ask. No, I think in the short term, just coming back to reality, electric vehicles are a tiny, minuscule fraction of the cars on the road. So if you're looking at, will electric vehicles have any impact whatsoever on oil demand in 2017, 18, even 2019? Almost none. Almost none. It's such a small. But when you look at some of those longer term oil projects that are being cancelled, the ones that would bring in Dan talked about the 20%, I think it was, of new demand by, out into sort of 2025, 2030. By 2035 or 2040, we just have a very different view of the vehicle mix and therefore of oil demand, yes.
Very quickly, China, as Dan's saying, also is one of the areas that everybody needs to look at in the scenario for financing, for world growth, indeed for just about everything. A lot of the Chinese getting off their bikes, so to speak, they're buying new cars. Where is the growth going to come from there? Where do you see? Are they buying electric cars?
So they're starting to. It's the fastest growing market. We had the head of the research organization of the Chinese National Grid at our conference in Shanghai, and he was asked the question, what percentage of new cars by 2030 in China will be electric? And he said 80%. And our chap misheard and said 18%, right. Said that's a lot. And he said, no, 80, which we thought was fanciful. But still, there is an enormous push in China for electrification. There's an enormous push in the cities for either electric or CNG buses. It is quite, more than possible, but quite likely that we'll see peak Chinese oil demand this side of 2025. And by the way, that's also the Chinese official position.
Yes.
Right? And so that's going to change the dynamics. And of course, then you start saying, well, but what about India, and can there be demand elsewhere, and so on? But that's already grasping for some smaller. These are smaller economies, exactly.
Yeah. We're going to have to wrap this up, and forgive me, there's a lot of interest there. Maybe I'll throw that last question here, and we literally on that note will wrap it up. Actually, we can't, but I was going to talk to people in terms of the future for renewables, if it's something that you're optimistic about or not. Maybe a quick show of hands. The future for renewables. Anybody think we're there? We're going there? I'll put 2 hands. Okay. We've got some energy in the room here. So they'll all be out there hopefully buying their second car, because here in this region we have to support all sorts of fuel for the moment. Michael Liebreich, an absolute delight. Thank you so much. And we'll all be looking forward to reading more of your reports. And thank you all.